Okay, connecting.
Usual. Hey, everybody, welcome to our special series, Active Measures, Chapter 4. I can't believe it's 4 already, Olga. This time, we are talking about Putin's God Squad and how the Kremlin infiltrated the evangelical movement in advance of the 2016 election. The reason we're doing this, as we say every time, is that Russian interference is not a hoax, no matter what Donald Trump says. So that's why we're doing it.
Can you believe we have to do this again
No,
in the year
no, no, no,
2025?
no. And what's amazing to me is that Donald Trump again said that election interference was a hoax in front of Vladimir Putin. I mean, he said this in Alaska after he rolled out the red carpet, literally, for this genocidal maniac, after he stood next to him and effectively treated him better than he treated any of the European leaders who showed up, certainly better than he treated Zelensky yesterday, had United States Marines get on their hands and knees to roll
Yep.
out the red carpet for the Russian president, something he did not do for the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, for Giorgia Meloni, the Prime Minister of Italy, something he did not do for President Emmanuel Macron. In France, the leader of Finland was here. The head of the EU was here. The head of NATO was here.
Germany. Hmm.
No, Germany. Merz, the Chancellor of Germany, was here. Nobody got the red carpet treatment, and certainly
They
not
didn't
the
even get greeted. Zelensky was the only one who came, who
yeah.
Trump came out to greet. The rest didn't even get greeted.
So, and then of
And
course, the part that we want to focus on, we'll talk more about this on Pax Americana on Thursday, which is our longer Substack that Olga and I do every week. But the reason we want to talk about specifically what happened at the press conference with Putin is that it was not a long press conference at all. He did not take questions like he did for Zelensky, but he did take the opportunity to talk about how his relationship with Putin was affected during his first term by the quote unquote Russia hoax, and how that somehow was so offensive to Putin that it affected their
mm,
relationship. So before we get into this week's episode, I just want to stress again, no matter how many times he says it, no matter what he does, it was not a hoax.
no,
It was a well planned, well executed, multi year concerted effort to A, defeat Hillary Clinton, and B, to elect Donald Trump. Specifically Donald Trump, because Donald Trump, as he has turned out to be, and as Putin knew very well, is the biggest useful idiot in the history of these kinds of operations. It is incredible how he continues to be a useful idiot, and that is at best. At worst, he's something else.
and he does it all publicly because I
Yes,
don't think any Russian intelligence services have, for the most part, they uh, used to have operatives or agents, influence agents, um, operate from behind the scenes. I mean, this one like literally removed everything and just
this does
publicly.
it. This does it. So, Olga, what we want to talk about this week is how the evangelical movement in this country was effectively co-opted for many years prior to Donald Trump's election. In fact, I would argue it began really during the end of Bush's term into Obama's administration and really sped up during Obama's second term. But why don't we talk very briefly? Why don't you begin by telling people who these players are, how they infiltrated people like the Billy Graham Foundation, including Billy Graham himself before his death, but really more focused on Franklin Graham, who now his son, who now runs the Billy Graham Foundation, very prominent right wing Catholic organizations over and over and over, not just the Baptist and not just the Protestant evangelicals, but also the Catholic, very, right wing Catholic movements, to weaponize them on behalf of Donald Trump. So why don't you go ahead?
So before I start with that, just wanted again for people, anyone new joining, the way we are doing this series is the proper way, which is what US media never did because they showed pieces, they never put everything together, as part of a bigger operation. And for us, the first, part, we started giving basically overlay of how KGB worked and the Soviet Union intelligence services worked, both GRU and KGB. Then we are now showing by pieces. So we showed last week how the NRA was infiltrated. This week we did evangelicals. And basically, it is to show that Russia used like each piece as part of a puzzle, and Russia went every route in order to put it all together. That way they could pull off 2016. And then eventually, I mean, we have God knows how many more, a few dozen more
Yeah.
of these documenting Russia's acts. But that basically just to give. So this week it is the evangelical puzzle. It is Russia weaponizing religion in order to infiltrate, and not only in the United States, they ran and are continuing to run the same operations across Europe with the far right parties through the Orthodox Church, through religious organizations. So, sorry, the main player who we can begin with is Konstantin Malofeev. He is considered the Orthodox oligarch inside of Russia. He was sanctioned for funding and providing logistical support for the annexation of Crimea and occupation of Donbass in 2014. He is one of the main figures who runs this finance movement. Another figure is Yakunin, Vladimir Yakunin. He interestingly focuses more on Europe, although there is a lot of overlap. I really, went through his network back in the day. There's a lot of overlap with the United States, but he mainly focuses on Europe, again, supporting the far right parties using traditional values that, they pretty much hijacked this term in order to appeal to people who basically the point of this operation was to subvert liberalism, subvert democracies, and show that, democracies are going the wrong way and that you have to get back to this twisted version of their, which basically is autocracy, because we're seeing the Christian nationalist movement here in the US who are supporting, king rule and supporting these extreme policies. So Vladimir Yakunin is another one. He actually is a former KGB officer who served in the UN during the Soviet Union in the 80s. There's very interesting part that he overlapped with a few people who had approached Trump to bring him to the 87 trip. But he served in the
And
UN as
sorry, and just interrupt you. The 87 trip that Olga's talking about is in 1987. Donald Trump traveled with his first wife Ivana to Moscow, potentially to talk about Trump Moscow tower. Of course, that didn't happen, but then he came back from that trip in 1987 and started strangely talking about politics and talking about the fact that he was going to run for president. So something happened on that 87 trip that made Donald Trump quite interested in running for office that he had never talked about before. Um, Go on.
And actually, just to add to the 87 trip, when he came back, he had taken out ads with his own money to attack our allies and to say that American foreign policy, that we're paying basically what he spews about NATO. He had taken these ads, and a former KGB officer, again, we, don't know how credible it is, but when those ads were placed, he said that it came through Lubyanka, that this active measure was successful. Yuri Shvets.
Yeah, Yuri Lubyanka, for people who don't know, is the former KGB headquarters, a place of death and misery for millions and millions of people. So, Olga, you know, to get to this whole operation of the Kremlin infiltrating evangelical movements, I think it's important to know that how the Russian Orthodox Church worked, because it's quite important. In 1917, when the Russian revolution happened, and I hate to go back over 100 years, but it's relevant. Um, there was a huge schism within the Russian Orthodox Church. The church itself in Russia was deeply suppressed. They blew up, literally blew up churches. A beautiful church in Moscow called the Church of Christ the Savior is a replica of an original church that had stood on the same spot that was blown up. And this is a major basilica cathedral. It's tremendous. That was blown up by Stalin. They built a swimming pool. Moscow's only swimming pool on top of it. Um, Eventually, when Putin came to power, they rebuilt it in the original form. So the Church of Christ the Savior, if you ever see it, is stunning, but it's not the original. That's how much they oppressed the church. The church
And
that
they executed, sorry to cut you off,
yeah,
they executed a lot of the pastors and clergymen
a lot of them.
also.
So, and I remember from when I was a child there. I'm not Christian, but if you were going to go to these churches, the KGB would just stand. They would note it, really discouraging any kind of religious participation. The church that remained in Russia effectively became a tool of the KGB. So the patriarch continued to be the patriarch, but they all became tools of the KGB.
Yeah.
And in the sense that they were ever allowed to go to international conferences, which most people were never allowed to leave the Iron Curtain. But to the extent that they were allowed to go abroad, they went there as KGB spies and KGB uh, to deliver pro KGB, pro Soviet messaging. The church outside Russia, so the Orthodox Church outside Russia.
Just
Um,
to, sorry to cut
yeah,
you off, just to add
yeah,
that, so after 1917, there were a lot of churches that were destroyed, a lot of religious figures that were executed. Stalin brought back the church during World War II. Now, Stalin was an atheist, but he brought it back thinking that he can co-opt it literally. It was under the control of the
right.
um, I think at that time even MVD, I know it was
Yeah, and over
predecessor
there.
to
Yeah,
KG.
yeah,
So it was under the control, and they even placed into like Russian intelligence officials into high uh places, positions in order to oversee it. So he used it for to create this patriotism during World War II. That was the only reason, not because he, like I said, was an atheist. Go ahead.
well, so the church outside Russia, which was the original kind of Russian Orthodox Church, a lot of these priests fled, were very czarist, understandably so, because this communist system was KGB, and atheist, and atheism was really taught. As a child, God did not exist. Uh, you know, what ended up happening was that uh, that church had a huge schism with the church inside Russia. But they continued to build Russian Orthodox churches all over the world, including there's a beautiful one here in New York on the Upper East Side. And they really looked very askance at the Russian Orthodox Church within Russia. After the fall of the Soviet Union, there began to be kind of a very slow rapprochement. Uh, the Russian church inside Russia eventually canonized Nicholas II, the last Tsar, who and his family, who were executed by the Bolsheviks, which went a very long way for the church outside Russia. And eventually, under Putin's watch, they merged. The schism was over, and they became one church. Understand why that's so critical to what's happening now. The church and the patriarch in Russia continue to be Soviet and Russian intelligence assets. Patriarch Kirill, the patriarch, which is basically the Pope equivalent of the Russian Orthodox Church, was a KGB spy. We know that from the files that came out during Soviet days. He is one and the same with Putin. They have an incredibly strong alliance. I mean, this would be effectively akin to Trump having an alliance, which would never happen, with the Pope and the Vatican, and effectively the Vatican being under White House control. That is what happens in Russia now. But because the church has absolutely had a reconciliation with the Russian church outside Russia, a lot of the churches outside Russia have now become tools for the patriarch, who is himself a tool for Russian intelligence. So they first spread out to the Russian Orthodox churches all over the world, including here in the United States. And then eventually through using those churches, created a political alliance with other Christian denominations, whether it is very high profile evangelicals like Billy Graham, and then suddenly really more his son Franklin Graham, whether it is with very kind of reactionary Catholic movements, but it allowed them to begin to develop and co-opt those relationships too. Olga, I think you wanted to jump in and say something.
Just to, make it very clear, this is not something that Julie and I made up. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was a commission in the Duma, and this is at a time that, pretty much at that point, Duma was not a rubber stamp. They were just trying to,
The Duma is the Russian parliament, which today is a
yeah,
rubber stamp for Putin, but back then was not a rubber stamp. It was
after
a real parliament.
Yeah, after
Right.
the collapse. So they did a commission, and one of the areas that they looked into was declassifying and releasing documents on the Russian Orthodox Church and the use. There was a man called Gleb Yakunin, no relation to the Yakunin I mentioned earlier. He actually, in the mid 90s, traveled to DC to meet with Congress people to warn them about the Russian Orthodox Church. And if you read his interview from, I believe it was 94 or 95, it is extremely chilling because he said if this is not addressed now, that the church will be weaponized in order to destroy your societies. So this is something also, this is not something that you and I are, like imagining. This is something that is from documented records from people who went through this.
So I want to just talk briefly about how they did this. As Olga alluded to, there is a Russian oligarch. He used to run the Russian railways, called Vladimir Yakunin, who she talked
Mhm.
about. Yakunin has an unlimited amount of money to play with to do these kinds of things, and he's kind of become the Orthodox patriarch, the religion not patriarch, excuse me, patron. He's become kind of the Orthodox uh, emissary to other religions. He sponsored something called the Dialogue of Civilizations Forums, where he invited Western religious and political conservatives to Rhodes in Greece, which is a beautiful place where, of course, you go there, and to Moscow, really another beautiful place. Why wouldn't you go there back then? Um, in the same time, the Russian Orthodox Church, under this patriarch that we talked about, Kirill, who was the head of the Russian Orthodox Church and a very close Putin ally, started promoting very explicitly anti LGBT and very pro natalist agendas. And they did this to both to suppress, obviously, LGBTQ movements at home, but also to establish common cause with the evangelicals in the United States. And it really resonated. You had something called you still have something called the World Congress of Families, and it became the sort of the key institutional bridge between American Christian movements, evangelical movements, and the United and what was going on in Russia. And you have key figures. I want to talk about key figures. A guy named Brian Brown, who runs this incredibly right wing Catholic organization. Larry Jacobs and Scott Lively, who are these evangelical activists. They are all participants and the heads of this Congress of Families. They worked very closely, not just with the patriarch in Moscow, but also with a woman named Yelena Mizulina, who is the lead person in the Duma in the Russian parliament, sponsoring anti-LGBTQ movement, anti-abortion legislation. So they saw what she was doing in Moscow and in the Russian parliament, in the Duma, and said, wow, we can really learn from this and get this kind of legislation done here in the United States. And that is how the Kremlin, because these are all Kremlin assets, really began to infiltrate these evangelical Christians. It is so crucial to understand that this began years ago.
Yeah,
Yeah,
2008
yeah,
around.
towards the end of the Bush administration, as they were preparing. They understood the Obama administration. They didn't really know what was going to come of that. It didn't work out well for them as they had hoped. So they needed to make sure they were going to influence the next election after Obama. It was about a 10 year, about a 1 decade plan, but they did. And it's critical to understand that this was all run out of the Kremlin. The church was weaponized. These Americans were useful idiots, another way to put it, who began to do this. And they were able to do this. There's a guy, you mentioned him, Konstantin Malafeev, who's called the Orthodox oligarch. He had something called the St. Basil the Great Foundation, and he promoted Orthodox philanthropy. He has bankrolled Russian operatives in the Donbass in Moscow. He's been sanctioned by the European Union
And
but
US.
and the US, but in 2015, this is very critical, he launched something called Tsargrad TV, and it was modeled on Fox News. And it was staffed by a man named Alexander Dugin, who is a crazy reactionary right winger influencer. I mean, imagine Sean Hannity, but even more conservative and much more nationalist. And it was produced, ironically enough, by Sean Hannity's old producer, John Hannock. He was indicted by the Justice Department ultimately for violating sanctions against Russia, but Targrad adopted this very kind of Fox Newsy format that was going to be very, very, very recognizable to the evangelicals in the United States who watch Fox News because they all do. And they blended kind of orthodox talking points with this right wing populist outrage. And it's interesting if because Americans don't know this, Tsargrad, which is a very important term, it's the old Slavic name for Constantinople. And Constantinople, if you remember, there was the first Rome during the Roman Empire and the Christian religion. Then Constantinople became the second Rome. Tsargrad was the word for Russia's claim to be the third Rome, which is the spiritual heir to Byzantium, to Orthodox
Targrad.
Byzantium. Yeah,
Targrad had me on a hit list.
yeah,
So
I'm not.
the type of thing they
Yeah,
produce,
yeah,
going after dissidents, and on top of it, all far right
yeah.
extremist content and
It
whatnot.
was crazy, and in addition to Tsargrad TV, Malafeev and Dugin created a think tank called Katihun, which kind of had these manifestos that they churned out in English, and they had an ally, an American ally named Charles Bausman, who amplified this content to Americans in the United States through something called Russian Insider. Now, I don't know that people who watch us are well versed in what was being sent out to American evangelicals, but suffice it to say, Russia Insider was very widely read. It was basically an online propaganda tool. He launched it in 2014 in advance of the 2016 election. He is a guy from Pennsylvania. His dad was somebody who spent a lot of time in Russia as a businessman and an
No,
American.
his dad was a Soviet
Sorry,
AP reporter.
sorry, a Soviet AP reporter, right? But he himself, because of his dad, spent a lot of time in
Yeah,
Russia after the Soviet Union collapsed. He, like a lot of other people, came in to try to make money there. You could not make money there unless you were kicking back to the Russian mob or to these other oligarchs, ultimately to Putin. Um, so he spent a lot of time in Moscow. Clearly, got turned.
lived there for
Lived
many,
there.
many years. Hmm.
He helped stage the Stop the Steal rally in Pennsylvania. He was at the Capitol on January 6th. And after that, he fled back to Russia. So they really tremendously married kind of this American media aesthetic with these Fox News producers and this American guy whose father had been an AP reporter who spent a lot of time understanding how American audience think, having this Russia insider where he literally, if you read it, your head would spin. It is truly Kremlin talking points, but sent to these evangelicals. And the evangelicals, you know, they what they did was they loved hearing this because it was music to their ears, right? It was the anti-LGBT uh, agenda. It was anti-abortion. It was a return to traditional Catholic values. And there's something in Washington called the National Prayer Breakfast. It's a long running event. I think it's around February every year, which every president, including Obama, I mean, attends. lots of evangelicals there, and ultimately they infiltrated that too, because in 2016, right as Trump was consolidating his hold in the Republican Party, right around the Iowa caucuses, Alexander Torshin and Maria Butina, who you guys might remember from our conversation last week as the people who infiltrated the NRA, also infiltrated um, the National Prayer Breakfast, brought a huge Russian delegation to it, where they mingled with evangelical leaders and power brokers, and really put that pro Russia, pro Trump evangelical narrative out there. Um, I don't know what you want to say about this, Olga, because you are fascinated
Yeah,
with it.
I
But
just
yeah,
want to wrap it up in a few things. With Bausman, I wanted to mention, I actually remember the launch of Russia Insider because at the time I was monitoring disinformation operations on Crimea and Russia's invasion in 2014. And I remember when Russia Insider came launched, and it was at the time purpose specifically for Crimea to whitewash the annexation and occupation of Donbass, to spread conspiracies that Ukrainians were committing genocide, in quote unquote Russian speaking territories, which is a complete lie.
yeah.
To say that Ukrainians were crucifying children, which was one of the reasons they justified this invasion with little green men, which were actual Russian operatives, Spetsnaz, mercenaries, and whatnot. I remember by 2015, like late 14, 15, it started putting a lot of um, pro-Assad stuff and whitewashing any kind of chemical weapons use, any kind of brutality happening in Syria. And by mid 2015, or maybe like fall of 2015, it got repurposed for the 2016 election. It was incredible to watch because I was watching, month by month, how this platform was changing. So that's just with this. And then eventually went into Stop the Steal Garbage. And again, mixing everything with orthodoxy, with nationalism, Christian nationalism, evangelicals. So this was that. With Yakunian Dialogue of Civilizations was actually, I spent, unfortunately, lost a year of my life looking into Yakunin, mapping out his network and across Europe. It was under the control of SVR. I actually
Which is
act
just Russian intelligence is what SVR is for people who don't
yeah,
know.
foreign intelligence services. And interestingly, the person who was controlling and moving operatives and controlling operations with Dialogue of Civilization, his name was Leonid Olyonya Reshetnikov. He, interestingly, was also the key person who worked on certain aspects of attacking the US election through the RISS Institute, which then was delivered to Kremlin. And then, and this was, he got removed in 2017 from this institute. It's an old Soviet institute that got renamed, but the purpose is the same, which is foreign interference.
Mm.
So Yakunian opened these Dialogue of Civilizations. One was central in Germany, the other one in Austria. Not only was he recruiting politicians, and then he also had another think tank that was connected to Dialogue of Civilizations called Franco Russi. Not only was he recruiting politicians, he was recruiting defense officials through this think tanks. He was recruiting former intelligence officials. You will see a lot of people within this web who ended up going to Crimea, to basically say that those fake elections under gunpoint were run perfect and there was nothing to see, and that Crimea, the people there actually chose to go back to Russia, which we all know is a lie. Um, so he was very instrumental in that. And then from around 2015, he repurposed his institutes using these traditional values. And there is a lot of overlap with the Ron Paul Institute, a lot of overlap with every far right extremist party through the dialogue of civilizations. Finally, the Germans took it serious a few years ago, and Yakunin not only is banned, but they understand that this was an intelligence operation to subvert their own country. But he, just to show you how far reaching, he ran operations in Serbia, Moldova, Austria, Czech Republic, Germany, France, Italy. Konstantin Malofeyev, who is his associate, funded the Le Pen party in France, specifically for their, what was it, the 2015 election. And at the same time, they were hit with a cyber attack, of course, because all these operations are accompanied by cyber attacks. So basically, you have this group of people with, along with Alexander Dugin, who I remember in 2015, because Alexander Dugin, we have to remember, is the original person who claims Ukraine does not exist. There is no such thing as Ukrainians. He's been saying this for decades. And Alexander Dugin, in 2015, started opening websites and writing manifestos specifically for Trump, why he is the next person who will lead this globe and change, the direction and the control of power in this world. So Alexander Dugin, Yakunin, Malofeyev, these were three critical people who were working, via various operations in order to put this together, in order to co-opt far-right figures, far-right propagandists, and also at the same time politicians and anyone else that they can, how you call it, get their hands on. And this had a big effect because we saw in Germany, the AfD party, those were Yakunin's fingerprints. He was involved in this far right party that is pro Russia. In Netherlands, same thing. I mean, we can have a 10-hour discussion on Yakunin's network and how it connects to the United States and how they, in parallel, ran the same operations to co-opt religious groups and the far right in Europe and at the same time in the United States.
Yeah, I want to talk. I know we're running out of time, but there are just two people I want to mention, just to show the connectivity between what was happening here in the United States and Russia. One, both of whom were incredibly strong Trump supporters. And don't forget, Donald Trump um, is a deeply flawed person when it comes to what evangelicals support. He's been divorced twice. He's had three wives. He has
Each wife, he cheated on
he cheated
the
on
prior
he
wife to
cheated
get
on each
married.
wife. He has shown his ignorance. Remember, 2 Corinthians, whatever, Second Corinthians. Um, he did not. He doesn't read the Bible. I mean, he's not one of them. And I remember having a conversation when I still worked at Fox News with Robert Jeffries, who runs, I think, one of the biggest mega churches in Texas. And I asked him why. Why in the world would you support somebody like this when Ted Cruz was still in the race, and Ted Cruz, lives a much more sacred life, I guess, if you look at evangelicals. I mean, only married once, knows his Bible, and spoke, talk the talk, really understands how evangelicals worked. Yes, Connie assaulted women. I mean, Trump has all sorts of problems. And I asked Robert Jeffries, why are you supporting Trump? And he looked at me and he said, because he's going to win. And at that point, I was wondering, it wasn't quite a done deal yet. It was right during the Iowa caucuses. It was really down to him and Ted Cruz. And if they had thrown their support behind Ted Cruz, it could have been that Cruz could have pulled it off. But they didn't. They threw all of their support behind Trump. And let me explain now, I think, why that happened, which I did not understand back then. But after Olga and I have done all this research, I understand it now. In 20, by the time Trump came down that golden escalator in 2015, Moscow had cultivated these evangelicals so much that it's unclear where Moscow's propaganda ended and the evangelicals spouting of it began. In March of 2014, That's how long ago this is. 11 years ago, before Trump announced his candidacy. The Billy Graham Evangelistic Association placed Putin on the cover of its magazine. And Franklin Graham, because Billy Graham at that point was in his late 90s, who
And
was
this is
really,
after invasion and annexation in
yes, in
Ukraine.
Crimea, right.
After.
Um, he wrote an op-ed praising Putin's ban on disseminating the quote unquote propaganda of non traditional sexual relations to children, the anti gay stuff. And this is what he wrote. To be clear, I'm not endorsing President Trump. Isn't it? Sorry, President Putin. I'm so sorry. I'm not endorsing President Putin. Isn't it sad, though, that America's own morality has fallen so far that on this issue, protecting children from any homosexual agenda or propaganda, Russia's standard is higher than our own? That's not a coincidence. Later that year, a man named Metropolitan, which is kind of I guess, somewhere a bishop in the Russian Orthodox Church, a guy
Or
named
cardinal.
Cardinal, like a high up guy in the Russian Orthodox Church, a guy named Hilarion Alfeev, met with Billy and Franklin Graham at in North Carolina, which is where Billy Graham was living, to celebrate his 96th birthday. After that meeting, he traveled to the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association headquarters, again in North Carolina, which is holding a summit between Russian church leaders and American evangelical leaders. And there, he delivered this massive broadside against sanctions the United States had placed on Russia because of the Crimean annexation. So, the mixture of religion and the Kremlin propaganda about sanctions and about everything else was just ongoing, ongoing. And it's not the first time he did this. In 2011, Hilarion went to the United States. He delivered a speech at the Catholic University in Washington, and then he traveled to the Dallas Theological Seminary again to deliver these kind of pro-Russia talking points, and met with George Bush, interestingly, after Bush had left office. But in 2015 also, and this is important, Franklin Graham flew to Moscow and he met with the Patriarch Kirill to discuss shared concerns about the decline of morality in the West, and the persecution of Christians in the West. Okay. And during that trip, he held a private 45-minute meeting with Putin after he wrote this glowing article about him in his magazine. And after that meeting, and Putin promised to support a conference on persecuted Christians that he wanted Franklin Graham to work with the Russian Orthodox Church to do. After that meeting, Graham announced that he and leaders of the Russian Orthodox Church would organize a 2016 World Summit in Defense of Persecuted Christians. That is the title of it, in Moscow. Which Graham then was forced to move to Washington because Russia passed new anti-terrorism laws to ban evangelical Christians, which is hilarious, right? The same way Russia doesn't allow guns for their civilians, but nevertheless infiltrated the NRA with pro-gun stuff, is the same way they don't allow evangelical Christians in Russia, and they think they're
Mormons.
terrorists.
Nothing. No
Nothing,
stuff.
nothing, but yet they're talking about persecution of Christians in the West. And Russian participants at this conference in Washington spent all their time railing against sanctions. Nothing to do with persecuted Christians, all about the Russian agenda. And, it's important because when they turned out for Trump in 2016, it's not only domestic politics that concerned them, but really a decade-long Russian campaign primed to view Putin favorably, to excuse Trump's praise of him, to treat Paul Manafort's change to the 2016 convention where he took out their um, call to arms to arm Ukraine. I mean, all
Yep.
of this. So just understand how the Grahams, and especially Franklin Graham, who's a massive figure in the evangelical church, was co-opted by Putin to then work for Trump. And the other person I want to talk about very quickly, because I know we're running out of time.
And then I want to add one more thing. Go ahead.
Well, go ahead and add it about this if you want, because I want to talk about Jay Sekulow in a second. But go ahead.
Okay. So one thing I didn't understand, it took me a while because I actually am Catholic, not really
Mm.
practicing, but I did go to Catholic school. I did take some Catholic um, classes. And I never understood where this violent aspect comes from because I was like, I don't understand. How is it that evangelicals and other religious groups are cheering on, you know, the vile things that Trump was saying during the 2016. I mean, frankly, they would execute, a thousand immigrants, and this would make them happy. And I never understood where this violence came from until I looked into this. And just to so people are clear, the Russian Orthodox Church mixes not only religion and geopolitics and a pro-Russian point of view, they also mix in violence. The patriarch has always, blessed every single like weapons. During the full-scale invasion, the Orthodox Church actually was working on opening a mercenary group to travel into Ukraine to kill Ukrainians. So basically a Wagner type group to carry out, operations and participate in the full-scale invasion. Um, During Syria, they blessed Russia's operations in Syria. So not only would the religious groups fed the pro-Kremlin garbage, fed the geopolitical, view of the world from a Russian viewpoint, um, and religious material, but they were also at the same time fed violence. And this is why I am confident that they have developed this tolerance of violence. And actually, like I said, we are watching what's happening across our streets, and this absolutely is going over the head of all these religious groups. Now, one has stepped in to say, maybe you're going too far. Maybe you shouldn't torture immigrants. Maybe you shouldn't do this, and actually follow what the Bible says and what Jesus himself says. So this is
Yeah.
one key point that in this indoctrination and infiltration, they also inserted this violent aspect.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you say that because it does bring me to this marriage between evangelicals, which we've already established, and Russia. And one of the vectors for that is Jay Sekulow. Jay Sekulow runs or ran at the time a organization called the American Center for Law and Justice, which was founded by Pat Robertson, who was, of course, one of the major people who gave rise to the evangelical movement in the 70s and 80s. He ran for president, if you remember back, I think in 1988. Very much as somebody who mixed politics and religion himself. So Jay Sekulow runs this ACLJ, which was kind of created to be the ACLU equivalent for evangelicals. And they had a Moscow affiliate called the Slavic Center for Law and Justice, the SCLJ. And it sat on Kremlin linked councils and advanced the same kind of family values lawfare bullshit, frankly, domestically. And it gave Moscow a veneer of credibility when appealing to American Christian conservatives because it was connected to this Pat Robertson slash Jay Sekulow organization. And it's an incredibly influential legal advocacy group on the Christian right. Incredibly influential. They focus on religious freedom, they focus on abortion, they focus on the role of Christianity in American public life. And under Sokolow's leadership, it actually grew into a really well funded, media savvy institution with ties to donors, ties to activists. It really became a huge influence politically when Sokolow emerged as one of Trump's personal attorneys. He investigated him, ironically, during the Mueller probe into Russian election interference. And what's so ironic about Sokolow's investigation or representation of Trump here is that Sokolow himself probably should have been investigated as part of this. I mean, the fact that the lawyer defending Trump on this is somebody who probably should have been a subject just underscores to you how much Robert Mueller did not really do the job that he should have done in investigating this. And again, this is not that Olga and I know any deep, dark secrets. We just do our research, which the American media has never done. And apparently, Robert Mueller decided he was not going to do this. But it blurred the line between what he did himself and everything else because its media arm, first of all, became a massive megaphone for defending Trump's policies and framing his presidency's aligned with evangelical values. They're on the Salem radio network, which is a right wing, huge right wing propaganda network. around the country you probably don't even know, but a lot of these stations that you might listen to are owned by Salem, and their job is to pump out religious and right wing propaganda. Um, you know, its international branches, Sokolo's international branches of the ACLJ, such as the European Center for Law and Justice, regularly filed amicus briefs before the European Court of Human Rights when it sided with Russia on issues ranging from opposition to LGBTQ rights and family policy and religion and public life. Um, there were cases that challenged Russia's gay propaganda law, and they submitted briefs supporting Moscow's position. So, the European Court of Human Rights consistently ruled against Russia in these cases, but the ECLJ, which is the Russian affiliate of Sokolo's American organization, provided legal cover and really rhetorical support for the Kremlin stance. And that is the man who was Trump's lawyer during the Mueller investigation and had access to information about Russian election interference when he, either wittingly or not, was very much a part of Russia's election interference. I mean, there's a whole separate thing to be written about Jay Sekulow,
Yeah.
and understand how insane it is that somebody like this was representing Donald Trump when his organization, an incredibly influential organization on the Christian right, I mean, Pat Robertson's organization, which he ran and expanded much more successfully, I would argue, than even Pat Robertson, was able to infiltrate American media on the airwaves, on television, legally, with Russian talking points, in an organization that they were literally overseeing that became a tool within Russia and Europe of supporting the Kremlin's talking points.
Yep. And
That's all you need to know. I mean, that's how they infiltrated the evangelical movement, which in turn infiltrated the Trump campaign, which in turn then infiltrated the first Trump administration. I'm positive the second Trump administration too, where you have somebody like Jay Sekulow, of all the lawyers in all the world, he picks Jay Sekulow as his attorney in the Mueller probe. Why Jay Sekulow? Right? When there were
yep.
other attorneys. Because Jay Sekulow himself had ties to Russia. And he understood what the Russian probe was. So, I mean, it's just astounding. I am, Olga, shocked, appalled, and disgusted that the American media has not focused on this at all. I am even more disgusted when I watched on Friday Donald Trump saying that Russia was a hoax in front of Vladimir Putin, the
Again,
Russian, again, the Russian,
let's not forget 20, what was it? 19,
2018 in
18,
Helsinki. Yeah,
Helsinki.
Helsinki. Um, you know, and the media just kind of shrugs and says, "Oh, okay, let's move on." No, we cannot move on because if you just accept it as fact, you're basically allowing somebody to say the earth is flat over and over and over again. Russia interfered in the 2016 election. It was a long-running operation. We're laying it out for you week by week in stark detail. The people who are interested in this should read it because nobody else is doing this.
And
You know,
share it.
and share it. Please share it because people need to know. So go to either Olga's Substack, which is the Trump Tyranny Tracker, and also I'm Asking Russia, her two Substacks. You will see in my Substack, Salty Politics, you will see a header at the top that says Active Measure Series. That is our series on Russian election interference, where week by week we're laying it out. And this week, as I said, was evangelical Christians. What are we doing, Olga, next week?
The Nazis.
The
Russia
Nazis,
and the Nazis.
the Nazis, the neo Nazis, who worked with neo Nazis here to also infiltrate the 2016
And
election.
just to wrap up this section, I wanted to add the final thing that the Russian Orthodox Church, I remember in 2019, I believe that Ukraine finally separated the church
Mhm.
from the one that reported to Moscow to Ukrainians. And I remember the uproar in the religious communities that, oh, Ukraine is persecuting and whatnot. But the reason they did it was because a lot of these churches were hubs for Russian intelligence operatives. I mean, when I say operatives, I'm talking about people who are passing state secrets, military locations, movements. And there were a lot of spies working and agents working within these churches. Interestingly, post full-scale invasion, because finally the West had cracked down on Russia a lot. Um, the Orthodox churches abroad were, basically became super active. They've always been active. They're always parked, located within a military facility or a critical infrastructure facility in the United States and across Europe. And just to show how serious this is, Estonia, I believe Latvia, several countries, I believe maybe even Sweden, have all either shut down the church for national security reasons, or are in the process of shutting it down, or are warning that the Russian Orthodox Church is a national security threat to the country because they have seen evidence that sabotage operations are being planned in them. And again, the operatives are there and whatnot. So I just wanted to, show that this is bigger than just, infiltrating elections. This network of Russian Orthodox churches is also being used to plan operations in the target countries.
Yeah, absolutely right. And it continues. And it continues. So we want to thank everybody for joining us today. We went a little longer than we thought, but but it's important because there's a lot of names and a lot of information, a lot of history that we have to put in context. And I think part of the reason, Olga, that we talked about as to why American media doesn't cover this is because they don't have this history. They don't understand how Russians work. Whether fortunately or unfortunately, you and I come from that part of the world, so we understand exactly how it works, and it's kind of almost inherent to us. Um, but it's a shame. So I guess our plea is please spread this information.
Same. It's infuriating, and really, we need to
Yeah,
push on our media to do
yeah.
better because
Um,
what they're doing with the everything, period, is
Yeah. So if you could please go to either Olga's Substacks or my Substack, Salty Politics, and just share this information. It's really
read
important.
it, share it.
Read it, share it, make sure that people know about it, because otherwise we're going to have this belief in this country that the whole thing was a hoax. And Russia will continue to interfere in our elections. And you saw that with Putin telling Trump that he said that vote by mail was the reason that he lost in 2020, and now Trump is moving immediately to get rid of vote by mail. He is a
I
youth,
actually have an article coming out on that.
as do I. Okay, he's either a useful idiot or something worse. But
Yeah.
at best, to give him the benefit of the doubt, he's a useful idiot for the Kremlin. This is not a hoax. The intelligence operation continues. They are still talking to the evangelicals. They are still talking to the gun rights groups. They are still infiltrating the Nazis, which we'll get to next week. Um, this is not a joke, and it's
Which the
not.
Nazis we'll get to next week,
Yeah,
and sorry for cutting you off, but they're extremely important because people really need to be aware that Kash Patel shut down the task force that dealt with domestic terrorism and that monitored these domestic terrorist groups and neo-Nazi groups. So this is like, I mean, really, like they are leaving a ticking bomb inside the United States with no one monitoring these operations as these people feel emboldened and a lot of them pardoned to basically plot attacks on US soil.
yeah. So we'll get to that next Monday. You'll read about that next Monday. We'll talk more about it next week. But I'm so deeply grateful, as I know Olga is, for all the people. I mean, we had a lot of people, hundreds of people joining us today, 12:30
Thank you.
Eastern. Thank you to all of you in the United States and abroad for being interested. We will see you all again at 11 a.m. on Thursday,
Thursday.
11 a.m. Eastern, to talk about this shit sandwich of a summit on Friday, and the follow up with Zelensky, and the European leaders yesterday. In the meantime, I hope everybody has a wonderful day, and we will see you all very soon. Bye, everybody.
Bye.